David's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, had once whispered sweet promises to the owner of that voice, had once built dreams with that voice. His hand trembled as he lowered the window fully. The woman lifted her face, and time seemed to stop. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, beneath the premature lines and hollow cheeks, was a face he knew better than his own. Grace, his ex-wife, the woman who had walked out on him 5 years ago because he couldn't afford the lifestyle she craved. But this isn't how our story started, and before we dive in, please subscribe to our channel, like the story, and comment where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this tale is traveling. Grab a popcorn because what you're about to hear will question everything you think you know about people. If you've done that, let's begin. The morning sun blazed over 3rd Mainland Bridge in Lagos, casting long shadows across the endless line of vehicles trapped in the notorious morning traffic. David Okonkwo sat in the back of his air-conditioned Mercedes, reviewing documents for his meeting with international investors. His company had grown from nothing to become one of Lagos's most successful tech firms, and today's meeting would seal a deal worth millions of naira. His driver, Samuel, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as they inched forward. The traffic at Oshodi interchange was particularly heavy this morning, with hawkers weaving between cars selling everything from cold water to phone chargers. David glanced at his gold watch, a recent purchase that cost more than most people earned in 5 years. They still had time before the meeting, but Lagos traffic was unpredictable. As they approached the intersection near Maryland, David noticed a group of women standing by the roadside. Their clothes were faded and worn, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Small children clung to their skirts, their innocent eyes scanning the windows of expensive cars for any sign of kindness. These women weren't ordinary street hawkers. They were begging, moving from car to car with outstretched hands. David's heart stirred with compassion. Despite his wealth, he never forgot where he came from. He remembered the days when he could barely afford one meal, when his shoes had holes, when people looked at him with the same mixture of pity and disgust that many now showed these women. He tapped Samuel on the shoulder. The driver understood immediately and lowered the window. The hot Lagos air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of exhaust fumes and roasting corn from a nearby cellar. David pulled out his wallet, extracting several crisp 1,000 naira notes. The first woman approached hesitantly, as if afraid he might change his mind. Her name was Blessing, though David didn't know this. She had 3 children at home and hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. When David handed her 5,000 naira, her eyes widened in disbelief. She grabbed his hand, showering him with prayers in Yoruba and broken English. The other women, seeing this act of generosity, quickly gathered around the car. David distributed money to each woman, giving them enough to feed their families for several days. Their blessings filled the air like music. One elderly woman even began to dance, praising God for sending them an angel. Samuel watched through the rearview mirror, smiling at his boss's kindness. This was why he respected David beyond just being his employer. As the traffic began to move and the women dispersed, David prepared to close his window. That's when he heard it, a voice from his past, though cracked and desperate now. A woman was knocking persistently on his window, her face hidden beneath a faded headscarf. The voice spoke again, more urgently this time. David's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, had once whispered sweet promises to the owner of that voice, had once built dreams with that voice. His hand trembled as he lowered the window fully. The woman lifted her face, and time seemed to stop. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, beneath the premature lines and hollow cheeks, was a face he knew better than his own. Grace, his ex-wife, the woman who had walked out on him 5 years ago because he couldn't afford the lifestyle she craved. The recognition hit them both like lightning. Grace stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears immediately began streaming down her face, creating clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. David sat frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the elegant woman who had left him with this broken figure before him. Samuel, sensing the tension, turned to look at his boss. He had worked for David for 3 years, but had never seen him look so shaken. The successful businessman who negotiated million-naira deals without breaking a sweat now sat speechless, staring at a beggar woman. Grace's lips moved, trying to form words, but only a whisper emerged. David finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. He spoke her name like a question, as if hoping he was mistaken. But the way she crumbled at hearing it confirmed the impossible truth. The cars behind them began honking. The traffic was moving and they were holding up the line, but David didn't care. His mind raced with questions. How had she ended up like this? Where was the man she had left him for? The wealthy banker who had promised her designer bags and trips to Dubai? What had happened to the 50 million naira she had demanded and received during their divorce settlement? Grace stood there, her shame so heavy it seemed to physically weigh her down. The confident woman who had once strutted through Victoria Island's expensive boutiques now couldn't even meet his eyes. Her clothes, which had once been carefully selected designer pieces, were now cast-offs that barely held together. David noticed the small boy hiding behind her legs. The child couldn't be more than 4 years old, his large eyes peering curiously at the fancy car. Was this her son? The timeline would match. She had left him 5 years ago, probably already pregnant with another man's child. The boy's clothes were patched and repatched, his feet bare despite the hot pavement. The honking grew more insistent. Samuel looked at David questioningly, waiting for instructions. They needed to move, but this moment felt suspended outside of time. 5 years of suppressed emotions threatened to overwhelm David. Anger at her betrayal, satisfaction at her downfall, but surprisingly also pity for her current state. He made a quick decision. David pulled out a business card and pressed it into Grace's trembling hand along with 20,000 naira. His voice was controlled but not unkind when he spoke. He told her to come to his office that afternoon. They needed to talk properly, away from the street, away from prying eyes. Grace nodded wordlessly, clutching the card like a lifeline. As the Mercedes pulled away, David watched her in the side mirror. She stood frozen in the same spot, staring at the card in her hand while her son tugged at her skirt. The other beggar women gathered around her, probably wondering why she had received so much more than them. Samuel navigated through the traffic in silence, understanding that his boss needed time to process what had just happened. David's mind was in turmoil. The meeting with investors seemed suddenly unimportant compared to the questions burning in his mind. How had Grace fallen so far? What would she tell him when she came to his office? As they crossed into Victoria Island, entering the gleaming business district, where David's company headquarters stood tall among other corporate buildings, he couldn't shake the image of Grace's hollow eyes. The woman who had once declared that love without money was meaningless now knew what it meant to have neither. The irony wasn't lost on him. 5 years ago, he had begged her to stay, promising that his breakthrough was coming. She had laughed bitterly, saying she was tired of eating promises for dinner. Her friends had convinced her that she was wasting her youth on a man with big dreams but empty pockets. Now he had everything she had wanted, while she had nothing. David pulled out his phone and called his secretary, instructing her to clear his afternoon schedule. Whatever Grace had to tell him, he sensed it would change everything he thought he knew about their past. As the Mercedes pulled into the underground parking of his office building, one question echoed in his mind. What terrible circumstances could have reduced the proud, materialistic Grace to begging on the streets of Lagos? The past has a way of haunting the present, and as David sat in his luxurious office waiting for Grace, memories flooded back like unwanted visitors refusing to leave. 6 years ago, David and Grace had been deeply in love. They met at a church program in Surula, where Grace sang in the choir with a voice that could make angels weep. David was immediately captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her spirit. She seemed to glow from within, her laughter infectious, her smile capable of brightening the darkest day. David was working as a computer programmer for a small company in Ikja, earning barely enough to sustain himself. But Grace didn't seem to mind at first. She would visit him in his one-room apartment in Mushin, cooking meals on his small stove, laughing as they ate by candlelight during power outages. She would tell him she didn't need fancy things, that his love was enough. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, held at a small church in Yaba with only family and close friends attending. Grace wore a borrowed wedding dress that she made look like it was designed specifically for her. David had saved for months to buy her a modest ring, and when he slipped it onto her finger, she cried tears of joy, declaring it more precious than any diamond. The early days of their marriage were filled with hope. They moved into a 2-bedroom flat in Ogba, a step up from David's bachelor pad. Grace got a job as a receptionist at a hotel in Ikja, and together they dreamed of the future. David would work late into the night on his laptop, developing apps and software programs he hoped would be their breakthrough. Grace would bring him coffee, massage his shoulders, and encourage him when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. She believed in his vision of creating technology solutions for African businesses. They would lie in bed planning their future, the house they would build, the children they would have, the life they would create together. But Lagos has a way of testing even the strongest relationships. The city's relentless pressure, its constant display of wealth alongside poverty, began to work on Grace's mind. It started small, almost imperceptibly. A comment here about a colleague's new car, a sigh there when passing an expensive restaurant they couldn't afford. The real change began when Grace became friends with 3 women at her workplace. Tonia, Sandra, and Rebecca were all married to wealthy men and lived the Lagos high life. They drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and spoke casually about weekend trips to Dubai and London. At first, Grace just listened to their stories with fascination, but slowly their lifestyle began to seduce her. These women were subtle in their poison. They never directly told Grace to leave David. Instead, they would make comments disguised as concern. Tonia would say things like, "Grace, you're so beautiful, you deserve so much more." Sandra would show off her latest designer bag and add, "Every woman should be treated like a queen by her husband." Rebecca, the most venomous of the three, would share stories of friends who left struggling husbands and found wealthy men who transformed their lives. Grace began to change. She started complaining about their apartment, comparing it to her friends' homes in Lekki and Ikoyi. She became frustrated when David couldn't afford to take her to the expensive restaurants her friends frequented. The woman who once cooked joyfully now served meals with resentment, making cutting remarks about eating rice and stew while her friends dined on Chinese cuisine and Italian pasta. David noticed the change but attributed it to stress. He worked even harder, often coding through the night, desperate to achieve the breakthrough that would give Grace the life she now craved. He took on extra freelance projects, saving every naira he could, but it was never enough. Grace's demands grew faster than his income. The breaking point came on their third wedding anniversary. David had saved for months to take Grace to a nice restaurant in Victoria Island. He was proud of himself, excited to surprise her. But when they arrived, Grace's friends were dining at the next table with their husbands. The contrast was stark and cruel. While David had struggled to afford their modest meal, Grace's friends ordered champagne and lobster without checking prices. That night, Grace was cold and distant. When they got home, she exploded. Years of suppressed frustration poured out in a torrent of bitter words. She accused David of being a failure, of wasting her youth, of condemning her to a life of mediocrity. She said her friends were right, that she had married beneath her station, that love without money was just poverty with companionship. David was devastated. He tried to reason with her, reminding her of their dreams, their plans, the life they were building together. He showed her the business proposal he had been working on, the investors who had shown interest, the potential that was just within reach. But Grace had already made up her mind. Her friends had introduced her to someone else, a banker named Richard who drove a Range Rover and lived in a mansion in Banana Island. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Grace demanded 50 million naira as settlement, an astronomical sum that David couldn't possibly pay. But Richard, eager to formalize his relationship with Grace, paid it on David's behalf, adding insult to injury. The last time David saw Grace during the court proceedings, she was wearing a designer dress and carrying a bag that cost more than he earned in 6 months. She didn't even look at him as she signed the divorce papers. Her friends were there, supporting her, whispering congratulations on her escape from poverty. David left the courthouse broken, not just financially but emotionally. The woman he had loved, who had promised to stand by him through thick and thin, had sold their love for designer bags and fancy restaurants. But pain has a way of either destroying a person or forging them into something stronger. David chose the latter. He threw himself into his work with an intensity born of heartbreak and determination. 3 months after the divorce, the app he had been developing caught the attention of a major international tech company. They bought it for millions of dollars and offered him a position as their African operations director. Within a year, David had launched his own tech company, focusing on financial solutions for African businesses. His innovations revolutionized mobile banking in Nigeria, and his company grew exponentially. Success followed success, and within 5 years, David had become one of Lagos's most successful young entrepreneurs. He bought a mansion in Ikoyi, drove luxury cars, and traveled the world for business. But none of it brought him joy the way Grace's smile once had. He dated occasionally, but never allowed anyone close enough to hurt him again. His heart had been wrapped in protective armor, successful but cold, wealthy but alone. Now, as he sat in his office waiting for Grace to arrive, David wondered what story she would tell. What had happened to her fairy tale life with Richard? How had she gone from designer dresses to begging on the streets? His secretary knocked, interrupting his thoughts. Grace had arrived, she announced, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. David stood, straightening his Italian suit and prepared to face his past. He thought he had moved on, but seeing Grace that morning had reopened wounds he thought had healed. The woman who had broken him was now broken herself, and despite everything, he couldn't help but feel the bitter irony of it all. As the door opened and Grace walked in, David saw her trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. She had attempted to clean herself up, but poverty clung to her like a second skin. The small boy was with her, hiding behind her legs, his large eyes taking in the opulent office with wonder. David gestured for her to sit, his voice carefully neutral when he spoke. But inside, his emotions churned like the Lagos Lagoon during a storm. The stage was set for a conversation 5 years in the making. What could have brought the proud Grace to this point? And more importantly, why did David still care? Grace sat in the plush leather chair across from David's massive oak desk, her hands trembling as she held the glass of water his secretary had brought her. The little boy beside her stared, wide-eyed at the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Lagos. The silence stretched between them like an ocean, filled with 5 years of unspoken words. Finally, Grace began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to physically pain her. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, as she began to unravel the story of her downfall. After leaving David, Grace had believed she was stepping into paradise. Richard had swept her off her feet with his wealth and promises. He moved her into his Banana Island mansion immediately after the divorce was finalized. For the first few months, life was everything her friends had promised it would be. Shopping sprees at the most expensive boutiques, dinner at exclusive restaurants, weekend trips to exotic locations, and a wardrobe full of designer clothes. Grace thought she had made the smartest decision of her life. Her friends Tonia, Sandra, and Rebecca celebrated with her, welcoming her into their exclusive circle of wealthy wives. They attended charity galas together, where Grace would wear jewelry worth millions of naira. She posted pictures on social media, carefully crafted to show David what he had lost, what he could never have given her. But paradise had hidden snakes, and it didn't take long for them to reveal themselves. Richard, she discovered, was not the successful banker he pretended to be. He was involved in elaborate financial fraud, using his position at the bank to siphon money from customer accounts. The wealth he displayed so ostentatiously was built on crime and deception. Grace discovered this truth 6 months into their relationship when police officers raided their home at dawn. She watched in horror as they seized everything, from the cars to the jewelry, from the furniture to the clothes. Richard was arrested, and the subsequent investigation revealed the depth of his crimes. He had stolen billions of naira over several years, living lavishly on other people's misery. The scandal was explosive, making headlines across Nigeria. Grace's face was plastered on blogs and newspapers as the woman who had benefited from stolen wealth. Her friends, those same women who had encouraged her to leave David, disappeared overnight. Tonia blocked her number, Sandra pretended not to know her, and Rebecca spread rumors that Grace had known about Richard's crimes all along. The authorities seized everything, including the 50 million naira Richard had paid for Grace's divorce settlement. Since it was proceeds from crime, she had no legal claim to it. Overnight, Grace went from living in a mansion to being homeless. The designer clothes were confiscated, the jewelry taken as evidence, and the bank accounts frozen. But the worst was yet to come. Grace discovered she was pregnant with Richard's child. With no money, no home, and no friends, she found herself in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her family, ashamed of the scandal, refused to help. Her father, a proud man who had warned her against leaving David, turned her away from his door, saying she had made her bed and must lie in it. Grace found herself sleeping in uncompleted buildings, begging for food, and washing clothes for people just to survive. When her son was born, she named him Daniel, hoping he would have better judgment than his parents. The child had never known comfort, born into poverty and stigma. Richard was sentenced to 25 years in prison, leaving Grace to raise their son alone. For 4 years, Grace had survived on the streets of Lagos, moving from one shelter to another, begging when necessary, doing menial jobs when available. The woman who once spent hundreds of thousands on a handbag now counted every naira, grateful for enough to buy bread. Her beauty had faded under the harsh sun and harder life, her spirit broken by the weight of her choices. The friends who had poisoned her mind against David had all suffered their own fates. Tonia's husband left her for a younger woman. Sandra discovered her wealth was built on loans that eventually crushed them. And Rebecca's husband died mysteriously, leaving her with nothing but debt. It was as if the universe had conspired to teach them all a lesson about the true value of love and loyalty. As Grace spoke, tears streamed down her face, but she made no move to wipe them. Her son Daniel had fallen asleep on the chair, exhausted from their long walk to David's office. Looking at the innocent child, David felt a pang of sympathy. The boy hadn't chosen his circumstances, yet he suffered for his parents' sins. Grace continued her story, explaining how she had tried to find work, but the scandal followed her everywhere. No one wanted to employ Richard's woman, the gold digger who had left her husband for money. The blogs had been merciless, turning her into a cautionary tale told to young women about the dangers of materialism. She had seen David's success from afar, reading about his achievements in discarded newspapers, seeing his face on billboards across Lagos. Each success of his felt like a dagger to her heart, a reminder of what she had thrown away. She had been married to a visionary, a man whose dreams were bigger than his circumstances, but she had been too blind to see it. The morning's encounter had been pure coincidence. Grace had been begging at that intersection for weeks, but she had never imagined David would pass through. When she saw him giving money to the other women, she had hidden, ashamed to let him see what she had become. But desperation had overcome pride, and she had approached the car, not knowing it was his until their eyes met. Now, sitting in his office, surrounded by the success she had thought impossible, Grace felt the full weight of her mistakes. The man she had called a failure now owned a company worth billions. The dreams she had mocked were now reality. The future she had said would never come had arrived, just without her in it. David listened to it all without interrupting, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to gloat, to remind her of every cruel word she had said, every time she had compared him to other men and found him lacking. But another part, the part that had once loved her completely, felt only sadness for the tragedy of it all. When Grace finished speaking, the office fell silent again. Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Lagos skyline. The city that had tested them both, broken them both, and rebuilt only one of them, stretched out below like a concrete jungle full of dreams and nightmares. He thought about the interconnectedness of their fates. If Grace hadn't left him, would he have worked as hard to succeed? Had her betrayal been the catalyst that transformed him from a dreamer to an achiever? Or would he have succeeded anyway, with her by his side to share in the victory? These were questions without answers, paths untaken that led nowhere. David turned back to face Grace, his decision made. Whatever had happened between them, he couldn't let her child suffer on the streets. He pulled out his checkbook and began writing, the scratch of pen on paper the only sound in the room. Grace watched, hope and shame battling in her eyes. But David's next words would shock her more than any amount of money could. He had a proposition, he said, one that would change both their lives once again. As he began to speak, Grace held her breath, wondering if Grace could truly come full circle. Was David about to offer her redemption, or was this another test from a universe that seemed determined to teach her the hardest lessons in the most painful ways? Let's find out. David's proposition hung in the air like morning mist over the Lagos lagoon, beautiful but unclear, promising but uncertain. He would help Grace, he said, but not with a simple handout that would solve nothing in the long term. Instead, David offered her a job at his company, starting from the lowest position as a cleaner. She would earn an honest living, enough to rent a small apartment and send Daniel to school. But there were conditions. She would have to work hard, prove herself trustworthy, and most importantly, never speak of their past relationship to anyone at the company. As far as his employees would know, she was just another person he was helping through his foundation. Grace's pride, what little remained of it, warred with her desperation. Cleaning offices in the building where she might have been the owner's wife felt like the universe's cruel joke. But looking at Daniel, still sleeping peacefully in the expensive chair, she knew pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She accepted, her voice thick with gratitude and humiliation. David arranged for temporary accommodation at a modest guest house in Serula, paid for 2 weeks in advance. He gave Grace money for clothes and food, enough to restore some dignity to their appearance. As she prepared to leave, Grace turned back, a question burning in her eyes. Why was he helping her after everything she had done? David's answer was simple but profound. He wasn't doing it for her, he said, but for the woman she used to be, the one who had believed in him when no one else did, even if that belief had eventually faltered. And he was doing it for Daniel, an innocent child who deserved a chance at life, regardless of his parents' mistakes. The next morning, Grace reported to work at David's company, Tech Vision Nigeria. The head of human resources, Mrs. Adebio, had been instructed to treat her like any other employee. Grace was given a uniform, cleaning supplies, and assigned to the night shift. The woman who had once spent millions on appearance now pushed a cleaning cart through empty offices, mopping floors and emptying trash bins. The work was hard, harder than anything Grace had ever done. Her hands, once manicured and soft, became rough and calloused. Her back ached from bending, her feet hurt from standing, but she never complained. Each night as she cleaned, she would see David's achievements displayed on the walls, awards, certificates, newspaper clippings celebrating his success. One night, while cleaning the executive floor, Grace found herself in David's office. The space was empty, David having left hours earlier. She stood there, surrounded by his success, and allowed herself to imagine what might have been. If she had stayed, would this have been her life too? Would Daniel have been their son? Born into comfort instead of chaos. The other cleaners, not knowing her history, befriended her. There was Mama Sidi, a widow supporting 5 children who shared her food with Grace. There was young Amaka, putting herself through night school, who helped Grace when the work became too much. These women, living on minimum wage, showed her more kindness than her wealthy friends ever had. Grace enrolled Daniel in a public school near their new apartment in Serula. It wasn't the expensive private school she had once dreamed of, but Daniel was happy. He made friends quickly, his natural charm overcoming the shabby clothes and modest lunch box. Watching him play with other children, carefree and innocent, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. David, meanwhile, watched from a distance. His security chief provided regular updates on Grace's performance and behavior. She was never late, never complained, and worked harder than employees half her age. She kept to herself, eating lunch alone, avoiding office gossip. The transformation was remarkable, but David remained cautious. People could pretend to change when desperate, only to revert when comfortable again. 3 months into her employment, Grace faced her first real test. While cleaning the accounting department, she found an envelope containing 50,000 naira that had fallen behind a desk. Old Grace would have seen it as a blessing, a chance to improve her situation. But this Grace, forged in the furnace of suffering, immediately reported it to security. The money belonged to a junior accountant who had been saving for his wedding. When he learned that the cleaner had returned it, he was so grateful he tried to give Grace a reward. She refused, saying honesty shouldn't be rewarded, it should be expected. Word of her integrity spread through the company, earning her respect from people who didn't even know her name. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what we want, but losing it and discovering what we actually need. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while telling it, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps our channel grow and allows me to bring you more amazing African folktales that carry these deep life lessons. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next week. I would love to hear your thoughts on today's story. What lesson spoke to you the most? Was it David's forgiveness, Grace's transformation, or perhaps the warning about toxic friendships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and try to respond to as many as I can. Also, I'm always curious to know where our beautiful family is watching from. Please drop the country where you're watching from in the comments.